Sunday mornings out from normal and the world is not the same.
Good morning, Sunday morning. Good morning, Sunday morning.
We're 40 Sunday mornings out from normal and the world is not the same. Said you waited for a warning, but the warning never came. Don't shine a light in my face.
Nancy gonna cut you a check too late. 2 years after your funeral's paid, 2 years after the grave, she'll be a little stronger for all of the dollars she saved. Watching you wake, watching you cling to your family slipping away. Watch her do nothing but pray. Watch her condemn the Republicans, take them to brunch and then shrug it away. Now watch us be outraged half of a day, then pick a new hero to face our leaders and think they could beat them, playing the game they played since Pelosi had real human blood in her veins. They're all one and the same, sold off stocks and they all maintain that the risk was benign and the virus was tame. Flash forward and 40 Sunday mornings fade, 250,000 people in its wake and the cruise ship sailed today. So motherfucker, don't shine a light in my face. Wait.
Good morning, Sunday morning. Good morning,
Wait.
Sunday morning.
We're 40 Sunday mornings out from normal and the world is not the same. Said you waited for a warning, but the warning never came. Don't shine a light in my face. Said you waited for a warning, but the warning never.
Read my lips, brand new taxes, starving all the billionaires and neutering their Visa Maxes. Topple Congress off their axis, mobilize the homeless, give them axes, call it praxis. Chop a couple limbs off the legislative branches, we'll show you the difference between air as a human right and guaranteed oxygen access. Octogenarians who barely know what day it is are culling countless citizens while sitting on a dais made of ignorance that was built on the graves of the slaves made to labor for its self-declared significance. And all to build a Congress full of millionaires who make their fortunes insider trading while they shit on all the indigent. So I got a bone to pick with our leaders and I'll start with the ligaments. Pick right through the muscle, dig the marrow out and serve it to the unhoused millions living in their minivans or watching their belongings get evicted from their tenement. I have a dream where we breach the walls of Congress and just let them in. And what happens next will survive in only text, cause there won't be any evidence. There will only be that heavy kind of feeling that pervades a space where there has been a reckoning and you can feel its remnants. Let any man who enters seeking power know that those who came before him suffocated on their eminence. That there once was a seal on the wall, but we quartered it and scattered all the pieces that it might prevent its semblance. And so we end the great experiment. We'll take all your billions, leave you 2 coins for the ferryman. Leave you drifting on a Dutchman floating derelict among the wretched seraphim. For holy is the hand that wiped the land clean of those who pose as gentlemen. That's my time, honey, cue the thunderclap and strike the theremin. And so we end the great experiment.
I think I liked it better being blind, when I couldn't read between the lines, and when I couldn't see the cracks in the structure that lay bare before me the whole time. I think I liked it better back when I suspended disbelief and swallowed pride. I thought I knew the difference in the red from the blue, but they both bleed us so dry. They both bleed us so dry.
My favorite songs don't hit the same way. I get to the end of a 4-minute track and I'm only looking back thinking, what did they actually say? So I try to sit down with my wife and watch TV, but I just see propaganda elevating the police in the simplest of sitcom banter, and tiny little altars full of offerings to corporate masters in every well-planned wide pan shot of the name brand stocking up the pantry. Pull back one long tracking shot out to the garage to the logo on the Camry. Nice tight shot of the Camry, close-up view of the Camry, slow pan up on the Camry, long slow zoom to the unmoving human who's up in the front with the tube pumping fumes to him straight from the back of the Camry. Ashamed he just could not provide for himself, let alone for his family. It's a blue pill mindset that spent 2020 making dance beats.
I think I liked it better being blind, when I couldn't read between the lines, and when I couldn't see the cracks in the structure that lay bare before me the whole time. I think I liked it better back when I suspended disbelief and swallowed pride, and thought I knew the difference in the red from the blue, but they both bleed us so dry. They both bleed us so dry.
Ignorance is bliss, which explains why a lot of us are so fucking happy. Quick to take the trip for all its trappings, never one to ask what's up, what's going on, or God forbid what's happening. A lot of us would strap into the ride and then spit right in the eye of the guy whose job it is to snap your fastenings. But maybe we're all born with that capacity. Maybe each of us comes standard with humor, compassion, malice, and audacity. Some of us are blind to the system, but some see it fine and say this is how it has to be. Some of us can stare wide-eyed at a nationwide human catastrophe and only offer platitudes and recipes. And I wish that I could tell myself that nothing's worth obsessing past my everyday necessities. I wish that I could cry fake news over anything that threatened me, tune out our abuses and consume a little levity. Wish that I could offer up my son a smoother destiny. Wish I had some better lessons for how best to answer questions for the things I've been perpetually questioning. But I'm too busy looking at our leaders, wondering what I might be missing from their messaging. Trying to find the reasoning to let 250,000 people meet an early reckoning. And even though I know the truth, it's hard to swallow something that's so literally sickening. Hope is ever dwindling, COVID ever beckoning. Winter slows your breathing, but your pulse is ever quickening. Even though I know the truth, it's hard to keep listening. I'm done with my epiphany, my innocence is blistering. I'd like to think I'd taste the earth before I'd ever kiss the ring. Hard to speak the truth and harder still to keep listening.
Sometimes I think I miss being blind, when I couldn't read between the lines, and when I couldn't see the cracks in the structure that lay bare before me the whole time. I think I liked it better back when I suspended disbelief and swallowed pride. Thought I knew the difference in the red from the blue, but they both bleed us so dry. Both bleed us so dry. Both bleed us so dry. They both bleed us so dry.
Legend says that Hercules swept Cerberus right off his feet and effortlessly set him down softly as a songbird. Atlas kept the world upon his back and every day wondered whether he could stand it any longer. And Tara Reade came out to say the man they tried to label the messiah of morality was really just another rapist. And I don't intend to hesitate when asked who was the stronger. Tara, like Assange, knew that carrying the truth would be the hardest labor. Tara knew that her assailant wasn't gonna make us any safer, and knew he's just the type of man to hand a decent foreign leader US printed walking papers, and knew he'd be relentless and aggressive in the war he'd wage upon her very character, that his attempts to weaken and degrade and embarrass her would be her only compensation. But I strongly doubt that anyone could ever have foreseen the stream of hate that came from quote-unquote progressives and the self-styled titans of survivor advocation. So if you really think there's something to be gained out of sharing your pain with the world, you are sorely mistaken. The Biden team just dragged their feet addressing Tara's allegations. Until they had a decent list of smears, then they aired them out on every station. And it turns out no one wants to hear the truth of who they praised as being worthy of such bloated liberal celebration. That no one wants to really know the person they've so valiantly defended, even when it meant they had to gloat and shit all over someone braver than they'd be if given the occasion. Now cue the faceless comment squad invasion. Cue those fuckers crawling out the woodwork to come analyze the way you wore your hair and what you wear. Like your appearance waives your rights.
Politics of Survival. I'm your host, Tara Reade. And you know, it was 4th of July. Didn't really feel like celebrating as an American citizen this year. I was feeling pretty blue, and I know a lot of people I've been interacting with have too, but I'm here to cheer up your morning. We have with us an amazing journalist and photojournalist, award-winning. She's been on the ground in so many countries, Syria, Afghanistan, Egypt. She can tell us all about it. Vanessa Beeley, welcome. And she's live from Syria. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you.
Hi, Tara. It's really nice to be on with you. I wasn't in Afghanistan, by the way.
Okay. I read that somewhere.
It was Iraq.
So,
no.
So give me all the countries.
No. Iraq, Egypt, Palestine, Syria. Yeah, that's it, I think.
That's it? That's a lot.
Yeah.
And you're living right now in Syria and have been, you were saying just before we came on, for how many years?
Since October 2019, although even before that, I was probably spending a couple of weeks to 3 weeks every couple of months. So I was here for extended periods of time even before that. But yeah, living here since October 2019.
Well, and I know that the Western media likes to try to take shots at you a bit because you're not repeating U.S. or NATO department, their War Department's talking points. So when you deviate from their talking points, they immediately pounce. I don't know if you've noticed, but yes, right?
Yeah, I have noticed for like the last, I think it started in earnest in around 2018. And that's when the real campaign started, and it's been pretty relentless since then, against myself and Eva Bartlett, really. The BBC has been gunning for me for actually really since 2018. But yeah, it's been never ending, but I tend to see it actually positively. I tend to see it as an opportunity because rather than actually silence us or discredit us, because they have absolutely no ammunition. People recognize a hit piece or a smear job when they see it. And effectively what it did, even the BBC Mayday series, which was a 15-episode attack, pretty much on me. A number of other people were mentioned, but the majority of the episodes were focused on me and my work, and of course the OPCW scandal, and the white helmets, etc., etc. And even despite this, I mean, I had people that had not been following Syria up until that point message me and say, wow, I watched the Mayday series, and actually it kind of makes you seem quite interesting. If they have to go to these lengths to try and discredit what you're saying, and when we understand that you're actually reporting from on the ground and they're reporting from London or Washington or Beirut, they're not inside Syria, then we kind of start wondering, well, hang on.
Exactly.
So in reality, it's brought more people to our work.
That's wonderful. And you mentioned Eva Bartlett, who was on our show a couple of weeks ago. Because you are a colleague and a friend of Eva's, I wanted to ask you what's really been stunning to me is the Western media, except for doing a hit piece on Eva, has not mentioned that she is on a kill list for the Ukrainian military. And this kill list is from a website that the US State Department had deemed a terrorist organization. And yet, because it's done by the Ukrainian military, and she's one of the journalists on this list, I mean, it's just amazing to me. She's a Canadian, also has an American passport, that they're not doing anything to talk about this journalist at risk, but rather just ignoring it and then smearing her. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we go back to 2014 and we remember what was very probably the assassination of Serena Shim, who again was a US citizen working for Press TV and exposing the influx of terrorists through the Turkish border into Syria, but on not only terrorists, but also chemical weapon ingredients, weapons, etc. And she was killed after she broadcast that she was frightened for her life. She was killed while driving on Turkish roads by a mysterious lorry that just happened to hit the car. Now, she was a US citizen, and her killing was barely mentioned in the US, and it hasn't been covered since she was killed. And, you know, that speaks volumes. Look, for example, at Alina Lipp, right? A German journalist reporting, like Eva, from Donbass. So she's a journalist. She's, if you like, she's embedded in Donbass, but she's reporting on what she's seeing. The German government has not only closed her bank account, but closed the bank account of her father, And if she goes back to Germany, she's threatened with 3 years imprisonment because it's perceived that she's supporting the Russian invasion. And in the paperwork they sent to her, they told her to not even come to the prosecution hearing or whatever it was, because effectively she's irrelevant to the case and her evidence is irrelevant to the case. So, I mean, this is the level of democracy we now have in the West. I mean, not even speaking about Julian Assange and all of the other dissidents. And there are actually many in the UK who are effectively being isolated, which is a form of torture, because they challenge the establishment, right? Not necessarily politically, but maybe in other spheres, right? Maybe they spoke about the aged care homes and things like that, or even the treatment of children in foster homes, the disappearance of children, etc., right? So they are dissidents in different spheres, but they are still being punished for actually challenging power. And this is where we're at now. You know, you mentioned the media. The media, in my opinion, is nothing more than a hitman for power now. Yeah. It's ceased to be anything other than this, right? It doesn't. I was reading a number of reports today, and it is literally, if you imagine all mainstream media take their bylines from Reuters, Associated Press, right? Those are the dominant news producers, and it's from that the Guardian and CNN and so on take their lead. When you look at what Reuters and AP are producing, I mean, they're just really running banners for foreign policy, right?
Yeah, talking points.
Yeah, you know, they'll just reproduce. For example, today there was Ambassador Burns in China was calling out China for, I mean, it kind of made me laugh, but it's so disgusting. Calling out China for supporting Russian propaganda in Ukraine, right? And heaven forbid saying that there were chemical labs in Ukraine. Well, yeah, there were. Victoria Nuland has actually admitted it. And saying that it was NATO expansion that led to the Russian special operation. Well, yeah. I mean, even John Mearsheimer and various other kind of high-level analysts have actually concurred with that conclusion, right? And here's this guy calling out China in China and saying, like, stop supporting Russian lies, support US lies instead, because they're real lies, right? And, you know, organized media outlets like Bloomberg, etc., are just literally printing word for word what he said.
Right.
That's it. So there's no balance. There's no comment from any of the Chinese officials who are actually there. There's no historical comments from members of the Chinese government who have been very clear in their interpretation of events in Ukraine.
No, I
so
mean,
this is, you know, yeah, it's insane.
It is, and I mean the murder of Shireen by you know, because you had been to Palestine. Had you met Shireen when you were there?
No, I hadn't, because unlike Eva, who was in, she went to the occupied territories, I think in 2008, 2009. Could be wrong, and Eva can kill me if I am. I went to Gaza in 2012. I haven't actually visited the occupied territories, and by that time it would be quite unlikely that someone like myself or Eva would be allowed to enter. I'm pretty certain Eva was banned after one of her last trips from the occupied territory, so she was banned by Israel. And you know, I even had problems entering from the Egyptian side, because Israel still controls, Israeli intelligence, Mossad still control who enters Gaza, even from the Egyptian side, right? So no, I hadn't met her, but I did an RT interview very quickly today about this insane finding that the bullet was too destroyed for them to carry out forensic analysis, etc., and that they've concluded that this was an accidental shooting. And, you know, I pointed out to RT, how can it be accidental when she's wearing a bullet vest, when she's wearing a helmet, and they managed to shoot her in the head? That's precision
underneath. Yeah, that's a precision.
Yeah.
Like,
you know,
I think,
so it's a cover up.
Well, definitely. I mean, the State Department came out with that report that it looked like they were just bending over into pretzels trying to give a narrative that would please Israel. You know, like, I think one of the most ridiculous headlines I saw regarding this was a bullet finds a journalist. I mean, how does a bullet find what does that even mean? Like that? I mean, that's someone who took creative writing at that point. And, you know, and over here, a lot of times when we are critiquing the corporate media, we refer to the Western corporate journalists like CNN and CSNBC as Western stenographers. And we call them stenographers because it feels like that's all they're doing. They're just copying down what the government wants them to say. And it's very frustrating as a Western citizen living, because you have now, especially since they've censored RT, there's no view other than through the Western lens, and that's a very myopic, skewed lens right now.
Well, I mean, they've also severely degraded discourse, because they've kind of fostered a debate arena where people are so gladiatorial. I mean, this began pre-Syria, but Syria really enforced this, right? Where if you want to have a nuanced discussion, you're immediately accused of either being an Assadist on one side or being an imperialist on the other. And there's no middle ground. There's no middle ground where you can say, well, hang on, I'm anti-imperialist, but I can still call out, I can still critic some of the actions of the government I'm defending, but you don't even get to that point, because before you can get to that point where you can have this kind of nuanced, intelligent, analysis-based discussion, you're shot down and you end up defending yourself from these ridiculous attacks.
Yeah, I've noticed,
and therefore it never gets any further.
It's really gotten something like, as far as, you know, well, journalists' lives are being endangered, but also their livelihoods, like you were mentioning, going after that reporter's bank account and her father's, which I don't even understand that overreach. That's bizarre. But you know, you're having it happen here with independent content creators that aren't even necessarily investigative journalists, but simply trying to lift up investigative journalists and their work, and they get demonetized, they get deplatformed, they get censored, you know. And it's been this Julian Assange, you mentioned earlier when you first came on, that was a really good point, because it's almost like the draconian way they've approached Julian Assange's, and I will say just public torture, basically, for publishing the truth of war crimes of the empire. For doing that, it's almost like it opened the door for all this, the rest of it, how, you know, set this precedent of how now it's going to be for, you know, if you have a different view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we go back to the Iraq War, which I think was probably the last time that dissent was to some degree allowed, right? I mean, everyone remembers the marches on the streets of the UK. We haven't seen that since then. And we also remember, what was it, The War You Don't See, the incredible documentary by John Pilger, where he literally hauled the BBC over the coals. I mean, he managed to get I think it was the then director of the BBC, in the chair in front of him, and he grilled her right over the BBC coverage of Iraq.
Right.
But you would never see something like, if an organization like the BBC reaches out to me, for example, it's purely to be able to do a smear job. It's not to actually hear what I'm saying. It's to hear what I'm saying, to edit it, to criminalize me and smear me and discredit me, and to do what they can to kind of frame my narrative in order to dismiss it. That's what it is. It's not honest reporting. It's not honest journalism, right? And that's what I'm saying. The media now has become nothing more than an extension of intelligence and security of whatever country that they're working in. So therefore, they're working with intelligence and security to promote whatever foreign policy of whatever government is in power. So it doesn't matter if it's Democrat, Republican, they're all pretty much following the same roadmap anyway, just with differing approaches. But they're still, if you look at what Trump did in Syria and what Biden did in Syria, it's exactly the same thing. If you like, from Obama and then Trump basically, for me, was like an economic battering ram in Syria. It was through the Trump administration that the Caesar Act was brought in. It was under the Trump administration that crops were burned, that the oil was occupied and stolen, that Al-Qaeda was given processing rights over that stolen oil in order to produce revenue for Al-Qaeda, a known asset of the US in Syria. And then Biden came in, and within 21 days of his inauguration, he was bombing Syria. So while people kind of say to me, yeah, but Trump didn't really bomb Syria. Well, yeah, but he destroyed Syria. Right. He burned entire swathes of wheat and barley crops. He occupied the oil, and he made it very clear, we're here to take the oil. I mean, the one thing with Trump, he was very upfront. Trump assassinated Soleimani and Mohandas, the leader of the PMU in Iraq, and the PMU in Iraq is the only force that resisted ISIS and prevented ISIS overtaking Baghdad, for example, right? So to say that Trump was any different to any of the others, or that a Republican president is any different to a Democrat president, is nonsense, any more than I would say now there's any difference between Labour and Conservative in the UK. There's no difference.
You've hit it right on the head. We've been having discussions about the fact that there is there's an illusion of a blue team, red team in the USA, right? The blue being Democrats, the red being Republicans. But there's no difference. They're both answering to neocons and neolibs that are wanting war, profiting from war. It's the military-industrial complex. It's people benefiting are like Lockheed Martin, and that's why you see the heads of those, Raytheon. You see them on CSNBC, but they don't even identify. They'll say they're a former State Department, blah blah blah, but they don't say, oh well, and currently I'm working for Raytheon, right? So I really get what you're saying, and I wanted to kind of ask you too, if you could bring our listeners up to speed a little bit about your reporting in Syria and how that led to controversy, and like how you have navigated that. So about your work and where they can find it and whatnot.
Well, basically, people can find my work. I'm still hanging on to Patreon, but I've just started my Substack, which is probably my main one now. I'm on Rockfin and a couple of others, but those are the main ones. I guess the controversy started because following in the footsteps of Cory Morningstar, who's absolutely one of the best journalists in investigating particularly the not-for-profit industrial complex. And she basically alerted me to the whole web of NGOs and the whole billionaire complex that was building the case for the war against Syria. And in amongst that were the white helmets. So Cory was, if you like, the pioneer in this subject. She's often forgotten because other people have kind of piled in on it and take it and done great work in taking it forward. But Cory was number one in my view. She was the first one to kind of point out the role that Avaz played, for example, the creation of Syria campaign, all of these shadowy billionaire funded organizations that were literally building the case for the regime change war against Syria. And so I sort of picked up the white helmet story and ran with it and carried out an extensive investigation on the ground in Syria, which included going to places like Eastern Aleppo immediately after liberation. And literally, I mean, I wish people understood, and I'm not bigging myself up, but I mean, Eva's the same. I wish people understood how hard real journalism is. You know, in 48 degrees heat in Aleppo city, in the bombed out ruins, we were literally climbing over the disgusting, filthy rubble of Nusra Front centers covered in excrement and fleas and everything. I can't even describe it. When I remember back to that 2 weeks.
Wow.
Finding paperwork that they hadn't burned and finding all this document evidence and stuff that they'd left behind in order to really build the case against the White Helmets and to make the connections between this intelligence incubated organization and its role in providing propaganda to demonize the Syrian government and the Russian government in particular, but also to provide this kind of humanitarian cover for the crimes of the various armed groups dominated by Al-Qaeda. And the White Helmets were effectively part of the armed groups, right? And so finding all of this sort of huge treasure of paperwork and documents and wage slips and everything else that enabled us to really make the connection between UK Foreign Office funded contractors and the White Helmets, and then making the connection between the leaders of the White Helmets and Al-Qaeda and other armed groups. And so drawing in this kind of network of terrorist armed groups, White Helmets, and how they operated, how they were funded to operate it, how they were supported. And this was even before, for example, the UK Foreign Office document leak, which basically vindicated what we had already found on the ground. And so that was my work really from when I first came into Syria in 2016 until today. And the investigation is still running because, of course, the White Helmets are still in Idlib. They are still receiving huge amounts of money from US and UK and EU governments, while they are in a smaller and smaller territory dominated again by Al-Qaeda. As Brett McGurk said, Idlib is the largest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. So they have full control over Idlib, even over the civilian population who, they exploit, they blackmail, they steal their houses, they steal their belongings. The humanitarian aid that enters via the Bab al-Hawa crossing, so from Turkey to Syria, this crossing is basically run by Al-Qaeda. It's a trading post for Al-Qaeda. So when the UK and US are screaming for the cross-border humanitarian aid to be kept open, and Russia is saying, no, I think we should shut it down because they know perfectly well, it's a gun running operation. It's a revenue stream for Al-Qaeda, described by Jake Sullivan as an asset, described by Ambassador Jeffries as an asset in Syria, right? So, I mean, I'm not making this up. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is something that has been admitted by US officials, again, from successive governments.
And you had Assad just make a statement recently that he believes that as far as it was a representative, or it was him directly, I believe, that he basically believes that the US is training these terrorists and moving them to Ukraine. Have you seen any evidence or heard anything about that? Or
I haven't seen any direct evidence, but I would not be surprised. At the end of the day, ISIS is another asset of the United States, as are the Kurdish separatists or the Kurdish Contras in the northeast. I mean, for example, we know for a fact, and this is documented here in Syria and by Russia, that the US is effectively kind of percolating ISIS fighters from Syria to Iraq. In Iraq, for example, they're attacking electrical power stations, so they're doing what they do in Syria in Iraq. They are then re-equipped and sent back into Syria. I mean, in the recent weeks, there have been a massive increase in attacks by ISIS against Syrian army positions and convoys in the northeast. And this includes, of course, the meager oil that the Syrian civilians are allowed to take from their own resources in the northeast. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is what many people don't understand, is the American or the US occupation of oil resources, and also, previously it was done by ISIS and now by the Kurdish Contras, and the Kurdish Contras are trading this oil outside Syria, and very little of it is allowed into the government protected areas of Syria, so to Damascus. So effectively now we have 48 hours queues for fuel at the stations here. People are only allowed 20 liters per month. Just think about that. How many times do you put 20 liters in your car, right?
Exactly.
And the majority of people here are employed as service drivers, which are the little white vans that pick people up on the road and take them into the town, for example, or taxi drivers. Right. So the majority of income is completely destroyed, right? In a country that's already under sanctions, right, and is already living 85%, 90% of the population well below whatever poverty line you want to put as a bar, right?
Right.
So the fact that the US is moving ISIS around globally, because they've moved them to Afghanistan, they've moved them to Yemen, they've moved them to Iraq, they moved them around Syria to carry out, as I said, isolated attacks against Syrian army positions or even civilian positions sometimes. The fact that they may have sent them into Ukraine is not, it's really not very surprising for me. I mean, right from the beginning, there were extremist groups heading to Ukraine. And going the other way, many of the weapons that are being sent into Ukraine, from information that we're receiving here, Syrians are buying those weapons in Ukraine and then siphoning them back into the northwest, in particular, through Turkey. So it's a constant loop of movement of both weapons and terrorists. And don't forget, in the northeast, there's more than 6,000 ISIS terrorists now in holding camps. They're not prisons, they're holding camps in the northeast, funded by the UK and US. Wow. In order, this is a threat, basically, to Damascus, right? That at any moment, this little army can be released, because it is an army. It's being equipped by the United States and the whole alliance, so by the UK and EU states that form part of the US coalition that is trying to destroy Syria.
And as you're watching this kind of layout on a global scale, you're watching all the kind of the virtue signaling of the yellow and blue flags, and a lot of Western European countries talking about refugees, Ukrainian refugees, whatever. But you've been to Yemen. Could you talk a minute for our listeners? Because
no, I haven't. Again,
in the West have nothing, hear nothing about Yemen. Could you talk a little bit about that and your take on that?
I haven't been to Yemen yet. I'm trying all the time, but since Sana'a airport was shut down, I wasn't able to. But since 2015, I followed Yemen pretty closely, and in 2016, I was included in a UN panel of Yemenis trying to raise awareness about the Saudi coalition genocidal campaign against the Yemeni people. And that includes, of course, the UN partaking in this genocide through Resolution 2216, which was based on the legitimacy of President Mansour Hadi, who not only resigned, not only had he overextended his GCC mandate by 1 year, and he still hadn't achieved any of the constitutional reforms that he had committed to as part of his being made president. He actually resigned in February 2015, twice, actually. And so Resolution 2216 is based on an illegitimate president who had effectively resigned his position and who had overextended his mandate anyway. His mandate was finishing and it already overrun by 1 year, okay, and who left the country and called for Saudi Arabia to bomb his own country once he left, okay. So, and originally Resolution 2216 was against 5 named individuals, sanctions against 5 named individuals. But of course, since then, it's been used to blockade 23 million Yemenis and to completely shut down on air travel, on importation of food. On top of that, the UN introduced a verification mechanism. So this means that boats that are coming with supplies for Yemen are often held up in the couple of ports that are still operational by the UN as part of their verification mechanism until the goods on board are perished. So by the time they even arrive in Yemen, they're completely perished. I mean, I've done a number of interviews with the health minister in Yemen, and it's horrifying.
That's horrifying.
How he describes the UN role and UN agencies' role in effectively running a starvation genocide. And what kills me, you talk about media. You know, the media all the time is weeping these crocodile tears and you know, sort of beating themselves up about the worst humanitarian disaster. But they never tell you who's responsible.
Right.
You know, it's just like the Yemenis are just starving, right? Nobody's actually doing this to them.
Right.
And they're not holding anyone responsible. Not any of the, as you said, Raytheon, BAE, British Aerospace, all these organizations that are supplying arms, the countries that are fueling Saudi planes, that are providing cluster bombs. It's US cluster bombs that are being used against civilian targets by this,
which are
Saudi
outlawed, but they're using anyway.
Yeah. Same in Ukraine. France is supplying cluster bombs to the Nazis to be used against civilian positions in Donbass. Exactly the same. You know, international law only applies one way.
Right.
Rules-based governance, US rules, and everybody else has to comply. That's it. International law doesn't apply to the US. It only applies to the enemies of the US. That's it.
Well,
and the media supports this entirely.
I know you're absolutely right. And I don't know if you heard this over the weekend. I think it was Friday actually, that a US representative for the White House came out speaking for Joe Biden because they were questioning there was another 800 million on top of the 54 billion that is going to Ukraine for weapons that they just approved, right? Sailed through no problem. Meanwhile, like in America right now, we're in an economic downturn that's so staggering. I mean, everyone's noticing it unless you're, you know, one of the super rich. But anyway, this spokesperson had said they were that this would take as long as it took, as long as it was necessary, because they're protecting the neoliberal world order, the liberal world order. Excuse me, not neo. I put
right. Okay.
The liberal world order, and I was like, that sounds scary. Liberal world order. Okay. So they took out democracy. They just took that word out. So.
But no, but what is extraordinary? I mean, someone asked me the other day. They said someone here in Syria actually. It was a high-level military guy, and we were having a discussion, and he said, do you think there's going to be an end to the war in Ukraine? And I said, look, if it's down to Russia, it will end with them achieving what they said they would achieve from the outset, the denazification, the demilitarization, right? And the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk, and probably the creation of some kind of buffer zone to prevent any future attacks on Donetsk and Lugansk by the Ukrainian forces or by the Nazi and fascist forces, right? But I said, there's no way on earth that NATO member states are going to allow this to happen. And then what did we see? Literally the next day, the Ukrainian army using long-range missiles against Russian territory.
Right.
You know, so it's almost like I said it, and then literally the next day, and this. So what is it going to do? It will escalate.
Yeah.
Right. So NATO isn't going to allow this to end until every Ukrainian is dead, as far as they're concerned. Anyone who thinks they give a whatever about the Ukrainian people is insane. All those people putting Ukraine flags and Slava Ukraini on their Facebook, they're insane.
Yeah.
Because what are you doing? You're actually sustaining the war. You know, just as people
neo-Nazis and that ideology.
I mean, this completely, you know, this completely blows my mind. It's bad enough that people were gaslighted into supporting terrorism in Syria. You know, it's not terrorism when it's in Syria, but it becomes terrorism when it's attacked in London or in New York or Paris, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same guys that are perpetrating those attacks who are murdering and massacring civilians here in Syria. Mm-hmm. But people were gaslighted into supporting Al-Qaeda effectively in Syria and globally, right? But the fact that, and then we went through the kind of the COVID hiatus when people were gaslighted into basically giving up all their autonomy, all their health sovereignty, right? Mm-hmm. All their informed consent, everything they just threw away. And now we're in a position where people are effectively supporting Nazism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
You know, I yeah. And I think as you see this kind of play out, because we're on the ground in it right now, so we're kind of in the middle of it. But when you pull back and look at the bigger picture, I mean, this is my opinion, but it's just leading us towards this. The West really wants the unipolar world and will not let go of power, and it will destroy anyone in its path that tries to bring a multipolar world, which is the reality that and think of how it would be if the West did cooperate and we had innovation and we had partnerships instead of war, right? But instead, is this grasp?
You know, look, you know, again, I have this discussion all the time, particularly in relation to the Great Reset and the WEF and all of this kind of negative technocracy, right? Mm-hmm. But a friend of mine said something that really made me think. He said, look, technology isn't going to stop advancing. That's impossible. But it can be used for good. It's just we're kind of programmed into, because it is generally used for bad, we're in this paradigm of believing it's all bad, right? Yeah. But you're right. If there was cooperation, if there was collaboration for the benefit of mankind, heaven forbid, you know, then we would be in a very different place. We wouldn't have the majority of the world bombed out and devastated and pushed back to the Dark Ages, which is what the US has been doing for 200 years. Okay, and Ukraine isn't going to be in any better state at the end of this conflict than Syria or Libya or Iraq or Yemen or or Palestine, any of these countries. Right. And I just, what I find quite frightening about this particular conflict, and for me, this demonstrates the end game perspective in this, is when you look at who is fighting on the ground as NATO proxies in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Ukraine is a de facto Zionist state. Right. Mm-hmm. The majority of IDF high-level commanders, the majority or many of Israeli leadership came from Ukraine. Golda Meir came from Kiev. Odessa was known as the Gate of Zion. This goes back through history, the collaboration between Nazism and Zionism in Ukraine. Wow. So you have the collaboration of Nazism and Zionism, and then you have the influx by the United States alliance of Wahhabism and Muslim and Ikhwanism, the Muslim Brotherhood. So you have the Eastern fanaticism that has been weaponized through history, right? Going back to the Ottoman Empire, Germany weaponized the Turkestanis, which then, of course, became the Uyghurs, against Britain and France in the Middle East. So this was back in the 1920s. So you have Eastern extremism combining with Zionism and Nazism, so Western extremism and fascism with Zionism, with Eastern. So you've got them all in one place. And, you know, when you actually think about this, it's kind of scary. Then you start to understand why Russia's operation is an existential war. Mm-hmm. And I know there are people that believe that Russia and China are all in this big cabal with the US, and, you know, the war is being created in order to economically devastate the West and Europe. And I agree, that's what's happening. But my view is, and I certainly am not a supporter of really any government, because in my view, every government is open to corruption. Every government is open to violation of humanitarian law, of international law, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. Because that, on another level, is human nature anyway. So I don't have this kind of you know, savior complex about Russia or China. Right. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the Great Reset, it's Western centric.
Yes.
Nazism is something that has been incubated and enabled by the West. Wahhabism and Zionism, the same thing. Mm-hmm. They've been allowed to flourish by the West.
Right.
Right. You know, Russia's relationship with Israel is nowhere near as close as some people like to kind of talk about, right?
Right. You're absolutely correct. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know.
I think it's really the other question I wanted to ask you, and then I'm going to ask Reade to see if we have any comments or questions in the chat he'd like to highlight. But I wanted to ask you about one thing I've noticed, because, you know, I'm a writer and I'm create content, but I'm not an investigative journalist. But what I'm observing about investigative journalists is all of a sudden, a lot of journalists in the West are just pro-war. There's no other word for it. They're just like they're egging on. Like if you watch any kind of White House briefing or any kind of like structural, you know, question and answer with these journalists, they're not asking, are there peace negotiations? Are there diplomatic inroads being made? They're asking how many weapons, how much more money, when, how, you know, and it's more and more. And then you're seeing headlines like, is nuclear war, you know, really off the table? Have we, and, you know, they're pushing that whole narrative. Pretty scary headlines in some of them, where they're toying with, you know, what they call limited nuclear war, which we know there is no such thing. What is your, when you see, because you talk to some of the other fellow journalists, what are you hearing, and what is going on? What is the consensus with some of these Western?
Yeah, I mean, I I really rarely get to have a civilized conversation with anyone in mainstream media.
Okay.
Because one, I don't
not
have
even down at the pub or anything like that. Okay.
No.
All right. I thought like at the
more likely
pub or restaurant they would drop down the.
Oh God, no! They're more likely to spike my drink, I think. No, I mean it's very rare. It's very rare. I mean, God, are there any old-fashioned journalists? There's a few. I mean, I'm thinking more UK. I can have a civilized conversation with someone like Peter Oborn, for example, because, you know, he's what I call a real old school journalist, and we disagree on almost everything, but at least we can kind of have a civilized discussion about it. I mean, I've kind of met up with him in Syria when he came, and, you know, we sat down and had a really kind of interesting conversation, but that is rare. I mean, especially with what I call these modern day disinformation babes that BBC employs, you know. I mean, they're fresh out of journalist school, they're ambitious, they're career minded, and they just do what they're told. They have no idea what they're talking about. They have never set foot in Syria, most of them, you know, and they just kind of get swept up in the story that they're given, and then they kind of get emotionally invested in it. Right. And they're afraid to kind of step out of line or to ask difficult questions because that's their career finished. So and then they're in the system, they're on the conveyor belt. And those kind of people you just can't get through to.
Yeah, and I think, you know, even with independent journalists here in the US that try to lift content, and I don't want to name any names in particular, but they'll present themselves as anti-imperialist or whatever, and they do give that content, but yet they'll avoid other content that's really crucial and really, and because they avoid it because they'll lose access with their other, it's just this fear. It's just come to this point where you will literally get demonetized, deplatformed, whatever, and I, since I'm constantly called the villain in the West, I don't, it doesn't affect me, right? So I don't care. But like for other, I don't know, those content creators or those independent journalists, if you can call them that, they seem fearful about really covering the truth. So I really admire, people like Ava, people like you, Wyatt Reade, and others that are just down on the ground and really trying to bring truth. So what is your kind of, could you talk a little bit briefly about your path forward right now and what projects you're working on and things like that?
Well, I mean, here in Syria, we're kind of on a bit of a precipice because we've got Turkey amassing troops in the north, and the Syrian military is moving troops to Manbij, which is kind of north, but in the center. So not in the Idlib area, not in the northeast area, but if you imagine the Euphrates, it's west of the Euphrates, but to the north. So the Syrian army is moving reinforcements up towards the Turkish border. As I said, Turkey is threatening an invasion. Of course, it's using the Kurdish proposed settlements as its reason to invade, because the Kurds are the nemesis of Turkey. Turkey has already annexed territory in the northwest and is building settlements there. So if you really imagine the map of Syria, its borders are not secure at all, because in the north you have Turkey, who's encroaching onto Syrian territory. In the northwest you have America and the Kurdish separatists occupying the oil fields and effectively cutting off the border with Iraq, except for the Bukamal crossing, which is regularly bombed by the states, because that's the only crossing open with Iraq for both trade and for fighting ISIS, because the PMU forces and the Syrian army forces collaborate in the war against ISIS. Then in the southeast, you've got the US illegal military base of Al Tanif, and they're training various extremist groups, including ISIS, and weapons are coming in from Jordan. So, Syria's, it has won the war, it's regained a huge amount of territory, but any country whose borders are insecure can never guarantee there isn't going to be another war or another flare-up or another increase or an uptick in attacks. And of course, Israel is also attacking more intensively recently.
You mentioned that, and it's interesting because I had a thought. I was reading that Turkey was really pushing about, going at Syria. And then, of course, Vladimir Putin, the Russian Federation, of the Russian Federation, assured Syria that they would protect Syria, right? And so then you have simultaneously, Turkey was going to block Finland and Sweden and then didn't. And then now you have NATO troops building up 300,000. I mean, I don't know. I'm not trying to go down a conspiracy path here, but to me, it feels like there's a configuration for a global conflict now being set up. And this is part of it. I think Syria and Turkey, am I wrong to kind of have that trepidation? Are you there? Lost you there. We lost your audio. Okay. We're going to give you a second, Vanessa, the audio. It's connecting. We'll get there. It was a
It's connecting.
There we go.
It's
we got you back.
Oh, okay.
It was like it was like a cliffhanger there. So what was it? Do you remember? Do you need me to repeat the question? You got it. Do you have the question, or do you need me to repeat it real quick?
No, I've got it actually.
Okay.
I can hear my own voice.
Yes, a little echoey. There we go.
Hang on. Is that better?
That's better. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Well, basically the fact that Israel has increased attacks on Syria, targeting the air defense bases, the early warning systems, the airport, the civilian airport. So this is an indication that it's preparing for an escalation against Syria. But if we go back to Zbigniew Brzezinski, of course, and his policy of who controls the Middle East, controls Eurasia. And of course, that has been the war over control of Syria since Syria's independence in 1946. It's been the war against what is perceived as the Soviet Union influence in Syria and then the Russian influence in Syria. And so Syria is pivotal to control of the Middle East and control of Eurasia. So in my view, the war in Syria is not over. It just depends which area is going to be ignited first, I guess.
Right. And then I had asked you about the 300,000 troops that now NATO has said that they are amassing. I thought that was very concerning. And, you know, there's always this presentation in the West that NATO is a defensive or protection. It's not. It's aggressive. And I think Dmitry Peskov put it really well when he said it's a gun. It's been used over and over again against civilian populations, and it's done quite a bit of harm over the years historically. So when you hear that they're amassing 300,000 troops, what is your thought on that?
I'm still getting a lot of echo. I don't know if I've got two screens there.
There we go. Can you help her out, Reade? Okay.
Oh, okay. No worries. Okay, I'll just keep going.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the buildup of troops is extremely concerning, and I think we are heading for an escalation because, as I said, NATO is simply not backing down. You know, it's not interested in peace negotiations. It's not interested in collaboration. The rhetoric now is aggressive to such an extent against Russia. There's no going back.
No.
You know, I mean, the Russophobia now is at a peak. And there's absolutely no backing down. I remember back in I think it was in 2016 when I was in Syria with the US peace delegation, and we had a 2-hour audience with President Assad. And it always stuck in my mind that he said to me, you know, at the end of the day, we have to give the US an opportunity to climb down out of the lie tree. He said, we can't corner the beast. And this is the problem now. The beast is cornered. Not because Russia has cornered it, not because China has cornered it, not because Syria has cornered it. It's cornered itself. Right? It put itself in this position. You know, it went into Syria to prevent Iranian expansionism. What's happened? Iran has expanded to fight the terrorism that the US introduced into the Middle East. Okay, Russia has expanded to fight the terrorism that the US has introduced into the Middle East, because amongst those terrorists are Chechens, amongst those terrorists are Uyghurs. So it's in Chinese interest to come to the aid of, to a lesser degree than Russia, certainly militarily, but in the UN through the vetoes, etc. China has been instrumental in protecting Syria, right? So everything that the US and the UK and the EU were trying to prevent is happening because of their actions, not because of the actions of the countries they're targeting, but of their actions.
Right, exactly. A self-fulfilling prophecy, so to speak, but also aggrandizing. In other words, it's lining the pockets of certain elites, not the American citizens, obviously. Or the Western citizens. I mean, right now, Great Britain is being plunged into, economic depression and,
well,
recession.
energy prices in the UK, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in the US and the EU, they've increased by 40% almost across the board.
That's amazing.
And that's before winter. So
yeah, wait, winter is coming, right?
Yeah.
Reef, I wanted to give you a chance to read any comments or questions for Vanessa. Any comments for her that's come through on the chat?
I can.
Waiting for you.
Kinjera says that there's 500 Russian troops en route to Syria. They departed yesterday. Scott Ritter recently said NATO hasn't got 300k troops available. Ron Paul in speech shared recently, right? So,
he's like they say they have 300,000 troops.
Yeah, I know.
Have 3,000.
It's actually probably true. I mean, the exaggeration is off the scale.
Jer asks, do you think it will drag on, meaning the war in Ukraine, a lot longer with the U.S. Perversely telling Zelensky to keep waiting to sue for peace? I'm betting you probably agree there. Russia wanted Turkey to stop interfering in Syria over the last couple of days. I'm trying to look for anything other specific. A fascist government needs fascists to help maintain control, so it's understandable we would cultivate fascist attitudes. Yeah.
Well, thanks. I thank thanks everyone for who's been tuning in, and I know some people even tuned in early because they were anxious. So Vanessa, you definitely have people that are supporting your work. So please support Vanessa's work, and I put a lot of her links down right below. So we're going to have this, and Vanessa, just so you know, it's out on YouTube. Rockfin. Sometimes my YouTube gets pulled down. So Rockfin,
mine too.
Rumble and Odyssey. I don't know why.
Regularly.
Jeez, I just can't imagine. But anyway,
speaking of which, last question.
Available. Yeah.
VS Adams wanted to ask you, Vanessa, how you got started in journalism. If you would like to elaborate.
Yeah, kind of by mistake. My journey to Gaza was sort of an odyssey. I've explained this, I think, before. My dad was a very renowned Arabist, and so I grew up in this kind of pro-Palestinian environment. And when he died, I sort of just started to get much more involved. As a kid, I think it's that way for everyone. It's just my dad. Doing what he does.
Right.
And then when he passed away, I kind of, oh shit, why didn't I ask him all these questions when he was alive? I started to get really interested in it all. Mm-hmm. And then in 2012, I decided, okay, I'm going to go back to Egypt, because as a kid, I was in Egypt when he was there as ambassador and special envoy during or after the 6-Day War. I've just given my age away there. And I was very little. And so I kind of went into Gaza actually to work with an orphanage there, Al Amal orphanage. So I sort of went in more as an activist than anything else. And I think Eva's kind of track into journalism was pretty much the same. And then obviously, when you start seeing all the stuff, 2 days after I entered Gaza, and I entered through the tunnels, so I didn't have a legal way back out. Israel started bombing in 2012. I think it was a 2-week aggression then. So I was there then. Eva was there at the same time. That's when we actually met for the first time. Oh, okay. And it just developed from there. I started writing what I was seeing in Gaza. Mm-hmm. More as they love to call me, an obscure blogger. But I don't really care what I'm called. At the end of the day, I just see us as bearing witness to what's going on and what is being ignored by Western media. And that means the majority of the Syrian people who were completely disappeared in the Syrian war narrative. So that's all I really see my responsibility as. I don't kind of see I don't care what anybody calls me, because the thing is, when you've seen what we've seen on the ground, you can't unsee it, and
Right.
the only way that you can express it is to inform other people about what is going on, and that's really all that we do. It's nothing, you know, it's I don't see it as anything important. I just see it as something that my conscience kind of dictates to me that I need to do, because it's not being done. There's a vacuum of information there that needs to be filled.
Well, I would say your work is very important, and I know it's caught my eye, and I've watched your work, and I appreciate it, and I know many others do. There was a lot of enthusiasm for you coming onto the show, so thank you. It was such an honor to have you, and you know, and have this time with you. And also, it's great that you and Ava have that collegial connection as well, because there's, I mean, not a lot of support for real investigative journalists doing, you know, pushing back on, you know, these military complex narratives, you know, and trying to bring truth. I know it's a struggle. So, you know, we'll just continue to lift you up. Your audience here that's listening, please like and subscribe this YouTube or Rockfin or however you decided to watch, and support Vanessa's work. Please follow her on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is down in the stream there. You can see it. And so Vanessa, I'll be signing up for your Substack, and so everyone should do that. Substack is great. It's a
I only got into it recently. Actually, I'm really bad at all these different platforms.
I know, but we have to kind of platform.
I know.
The censorship, it's like whack-a-mole, isn't it?
Yeah.
But all right, any parting thoughts before we depart here?
No, I mean, just to say thank you for having me on, and that I really appreciate the work that people like you are doing to provide a platform for other independent journalists, because it's actually really important with the dwindling Google controlled network of platforms, you know, and social media. It's really important that these independent areas for discussion come to light and are supported also. You know, the two, it's a synergy. We can't do our work unless someone's there to actually amplify what we're saying. So hugely appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you. All right. Well, you have, I know it's evening there. You have a good evening, and we'll talk again soon. I'll have you on again. And everyone who's listening, thank you so much for your support, and we'll see you next time. There you have it. Good day.